She had 30 seconds to decide if her marriage was worth saving, and standing there in that ballroom full of crystal chandeliers and champagne laughter, Victoria already knew the answer. Her hand trembled inside her small evening pose. Fingers pressed against a thin stack of papers that could end 3 years of her life in a single signature, and across the room stood the man she had once loved so completely that she gave up everything for him. He didn't know she was pregnant. He didn't know she knew about Amanda. And in exactly 6 days, a stranger in a small Brooklyn diner would change the entire direction of her life, though Victoria had no way of knowing that yet. Because right now, all she could feel was her heart pounding beneath emerald silk, and all she could think about was whether she had the courage to do what needed to be done. The Thornton Industries Christmas Gala sparkled the way it always did, the kind of party where wealth wasn't just displayed but performed, where every laugh had an audience and every smile was for sale. Victoria had learned to move through rooms like this one, had spent 3 years learning the choreography of Manhattan's elite, but tonight the noise felt far away, muffled, like she was underwater and everyone else was breathing fine on the surface. She watched Marcus from across the room, tall and effortless in his tailored black tuxedo, his dark hair swept back the way he always wore it for cameras, surrounded by men who wanted his money and women who wanted his attention. He used to look at her like that. She used to be the only person in a room worth looking at. She hadn't always felt like a stranger in this world. Once, she had been a kindergarten teacher, the kind of woman who spent her Saturdays volunteering at children's hospitals instead of charity galas, and Marcus had told her that her kindness, her authenticity, was a thing that captivated him most, that she was different from every calculating woman in his orbit. She had believed him. God help her. She had believed every word, because back then his eyes had held something real, something that made her feel chosen instead of collected. But that man had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by a stranger who wore her husband's face and came home later and later until he simply stopped coming home at all. Melissa Bradford floated over first, the way she always did, dressed in disdain wrapped in silk, cooing about how stunning Victoria looked while her eyes searched for cracks in the facade. Victoria forced a smile and said she was just tired, her free hand instinctively drifting to her stomach before she caught herself, because the truth was so much heavier than tired. 3 days earlier she had sat in a doctor's office staring at a small flickering heartbeat on an ultrasound screen, 8 weeks along, carrying a secret that would change everything, a secret Marcus didn't know existed. And underneath that secret sat another one, colder and sharper, the one she discovered 2 weeks earlier when his phone buzzed during one of the rare dinners he'd actually stayed home for. She hadn't meant to look. She told herself that 100 times in the days that followed, but curiosity had become suspicion, and suspicion had become certainty the moment she opened his phone while he showered and found 6 months of messages between her husband and his executive assistant, Amanda Pierce. Hotel confirmations, secret meetings during business trips, and worst of all, the words Marcus had used to describe their marriage to another woman, a mistake, something he'd gotten into too young, a wife who simply didn't understand his world. Victoria had cried for 2 days straight after that, barely able to get out of bed, calling in sick to the volunteer job she'd only just started rebuilding. But somewhere in that grief, a decision had quietly hardened into resolve, and tonight she intended to follow through on it. Marcus appeared beside her the way he always did, his hand settling on the small of her back with practiced ease, the picture of a devoted husband for anyone watching. He wanted her to meet potential investors. He said it was important. When Victoria said they needed to talk, he brushed her off the way he'd brushed off every quiet request for his attention over the last 3 years, telling her it could wait until after the party, and something inside her simply stopped bending. She had spent 3 years waiting for tomorrow, waiting for him to have time, waiting for the partner he'd promised to become, and standing there under those chandeliers, she realized tomorrow was never coming. The room seemed to hold its breath as she pulled the envelope from her purse. Marcus's face moved through confusion, then disbelief, then something colder as he read the word divorce, and when she told him she knew about Amanda, she watched guilt flicker across his features before he buried it under practiced defensiveness. She told him there would never be a right time, that there was never a right time to talk about their marriage or about anything that mattered to her, and his silence was the only answer she needed. With shaking hands, she pressed the papers against his chest and asked him to sign them, to let them end this with whatever dignity they had left, and something passed between them in that moment, something that might have been recognition, or might simply have been surrender. He signed without reading a single word. Victoria walked out of that penthouse into the cold December night with the papers clutched to her chest, one hand pressed against the secret growing beneath her ribs, unaware that 6 days later, a snowstorm and a kind stranger would set an entirely different story into motion, when it would eventually force her back into that same glass tower she was walking away from. Murphy's Diner in Brooklyn felt like another planet compared to the world she'd just left. Checkered tablecloths worn soft with use, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and nobody who cared what designer she was wearing. Victoria sat in a corner booth, surrounded by bank statements and apartment listings, the practical wreckage of starting over, painfully aware that the prenuptial agreement Marcus had insisted on would leave her with barely 6 months of breathing room. Her teaching credential had lapsed years ago because Mrs. Marcus Thornton wasn't supposed to work. He'd told her once, making isolation sound like a gift. Now she was going to be a mother with no job, no home of her own, and a settlement that wouldn't stretch far enough to matter. The bell above the door chimed, and a man walked in shaking snow from his coat, tall, a little disheveled, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of tire that came from long hours spent caring for other people rather than himself. Diane, the waitress, called him Dr. Bennett with obvious affection, and he settled into a booth with a worn leather journal, writing quietly while snow gathered thicker against the windows. Victoria watched him for a moment longer than she meant to, struck by how peaceful he seemed, how different from the performative energy of every room she'd occupied for the last 3 years, though she had no idea yet how much that quiet stranger was about to matter. When one of her papers slipped to the floor, he crossed the diner to return it, and something in the directness of his question, "Are you all right? You look like you could use a friend," cracked something open in her that she hadn't expected to crack. In Marcus's world, nobody said what they actually meant. Everything was subtext and strategy. Andrew Bennett simply asked, and before Victoria understood what was happening, she was telling a total stranger about the divorce, about feeling lost, about trying to figure out how to rebuild a life from nothing, though she kept the pregnancy folded carefully out of sight, still too raw and too vulnerable to hand to someone she'd just met. He was a pediatrician at Brooklyn Children's Hospital, the son of 2 teachers from Boston who'd once expected him to inherit a comfortable private practice, expectations he'd walked away from to treat children whose families could barely afford care, a choice that had cost him his relationship with his own father. When he recognized her name from the gossip sites, Victoria braced for judgment, started gathering her things to leave, but Andrew told her gently that what she'd done took incredible strength, that walking away from expectations was something he understood better than most people could. And somewhere in that conversation, laughing for what felt like the first time in months, Victoria realized she had stumbled into the first honest exchange she'd had with another human being in longer than she wanted to admit. By the time the storm outside had turned into a full blizzard and every hotel in the city was booked solid for the holidays, Andrew offered his guest room with no expectation attached, just one person helping another, and every instinct told Victoria to say no. But exhaustion and fear won out over caution, and she found herself in a stranger's modest Brooklyn brownstone, surrounded by books instead of trophies, in a home that felt lived in rather than displayed. That night, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize, from Melissa Bradford of all people, saying there was something about Amanda she needed to know, and Victoria had no idea that this single text was about to pull her back into a world she'd just fought so hard to leave. The next morning, Andrew somehow already knew about the baby before she said a word, reading it in the water she'd ordered instead of coffee, in the way her hand kept drifting to her stomach without her noticing. He didn't push, didn't judge, just told her congratulations and asked how far along she was, and something about his steadiness made Victoria's eyes sting in a way she wasn't prepared for. When she told him she wasn't planning to tell Marcus, that she didn't want her child growing up watching a father choose work and a mistress over family, Andrew didn't argue, only offered quietly that kids had a way of changing people, that his own father had been a workaholic until he was born. At noon, Melissa arrived at Café Loon 15 minutes late in a fur coat, nervous in a way that felt entirely unlike her, and what she revealed next turned Victoria's stomach to ice. Amanda Pierce wasn't simply having an affair with Marcus. She was systematically documenting his financial irregularities, preparing to force him out of his own company, and she wasn't even in love with him at all. She'd once worked for Marcus's biggest competitor before being fired for corporate espionage, and every intimate moment with Marcus had been a calculated step toward taking Thornton Industry for herself. Victoria sat frozen, absorbing the fact that the woman who had destroyed her marriage had never actually wanted her husband at all, only what he owned, and that her unborn child now stood between Amanda and everything she'd been building toward. Melissa slid a flash drive across the table, evidence her own husband had gathered, and told Victoria that whether she liked it or not, this had stopped being about her marriage the moment she got pregnant, because that baby was Marcus's heir, and if Amanda succeeded, there would be nothing left to inherit. Victoria left the cafe with the drive burning a hole in her pocket, and as she walked through the snow-covered streets replaying every word Melissa had said, she glanced across the street and felt her blood run cold. Amanda Pierce stood there in the falling snow, staring directly at her with a cold, calculating smile, and in that single frozen moment, Victoria understood with absolute certainty that Amanda now knew exactly how much she knew. She ran the rest of the way back to Andrew's brownstone, hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. And when she told him everything, his expression darkened with a seriousness she hadn't seen from him before. He told her plainly that she needed to go to Marcus that night, that if Amanda suspected Victoria had proof, she might accelerate whatever she was planning, and even though every part of Victoria recoiled at the thought of walking back into that glass tower, she knew he was right. Together they reviewed the files on the flash drive, emails between Amanda and Thornton's rivals, financial records exposing a plan sophisticated enough to dismantle an entire company, and just as the full scope of the betrayal became clear, Victoria's phone rang with Marcus's name flashing across the screen, his voice cracking with a fear she had never once heard from him in 3 years of marriage. Amanda had threatened to go public unless he signed over 40% of his shares, and despite everything he had done to her, despite every night she'd spent alone waiting for a husband who never came home, Victoria felt an unexpected pull of sympathy she wasn't ready for. Andrew insisted on coming with her, refusing to let her face this alone, and the two of them rode up to the 4th to 5th floor of Thornton Industries, where Marcus stood at the windows looking smaller and more defeated than Victoria had ever seen him. The confident man she'd married reduced to someone who finally understood exactly what it felt like to be deceived by someone he trusted completely. She laid out everything Melissa had told her and plugged in the flash drive, watching Marcus's face collapse through disbelief, anger, and finally a devastating kind of clarity as he realized Amanda had never loved him at all. Andrew was the one who told him plainly that the only way forward was to go to the authorities immediately, that corporate espionage was a federal crime and the only real risk left was letting her win. And something in Marcus finally shifted, some old armor of pride and image cracking just enough to let the truth through. As he called his attorney, Victoria stood at the windows overlooking the city where her entire life had rearranged itself in a matter of weeks, and Andrew came to stand quietly beside her, telling her she'd done the right thing, though Victoria wasn't sure yet if doing the right thing was supposed to feel this heavy. Before she left that night, Marcus asked for one private moment, and in that vast office he finally said the words he had waited 3 years to hear, that he had been a fool, that he had thrown away the one real thing in his life chasing profit and image, that he loved her and always had, even if he'd shown it in every wrong way imaginable. Victoria let the words land without letting them move her, told him that sorry didn't fix what was broken, that love without action had never been enough to hold a marriage together, and even as hope flickered in his eyes when he asked for another chance, she said no, firm and final, the divorce would stand. And in that quiet office 34 floors above the city, she made a choice that would define the rest of her story, deciding not yet to tell him about the child growing inside her, choosing instead to protect that secret a little longer, unaware of exactly how and when the truth would eventually find its way out. 3 months later, Victoria stood in the doorway of a small, bright apartment in Brooklyn that Andrew had helped her find, her pregnancy now impossible to hide, her teaching credential reinstated, a job waiting for her in the fall. It wasn't the glittering life she'd once lived on Fifth Avenue, but it was Hayes, entirely and honestly Hayes, built from nothing but her own hands and the quiet, steady presence of a man who had never once pushed her for anything more than friendship, even as she noticed the tenderness in his eyes whenever he talked about the baby. Marcus had reached out twice since that night in his office, once to tell her Amanda had been arrested on multiple charges, once simply to ask her to coffee, and both times Victoria had said no, believing that chapter of her life was finally closed. She had no idea fate had one more collision waiting for her. Leaving her prenatal yoga class one Saturday morning, she walked directly into Marcus on the sidewalk, and the shock on his face when his eyes dropped to her unmistakable baby bump told her instantly that the secret was over. She could have lied, could have claimed the child belonged to someone else, but looking into his eyes she found she no longer had the energy for more deception, and when she told him the truth, that the baby was his, Conceived before she'd even known about Amanda, his entire world seemed to buckle beneath him on that quiet street corner. He asked why she hadn't told him, and Victoria answered honestly that she hadn't wanted her child raised by a father who resented them for complicating his perfect life, that she'd wanted better for her baby than a man who was present in body but never in spirit. Marcus begged her not to shut him out, told her he had spent 3 months in therapy, that he had stepped back from daily control of his company to rebuild something resembling balance in his life, that losing her and nearly losing everything else had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Victoria studied him carefully, searching for the manipulation she'd learned to recognize in this world, but found only something raw, something that looked disturbingly like real remorse, and she told him to send his therapist information so she could verify the truth for herself before deciding anything about their child's future. As she walked away, Andrew appeared at her side the way he always did, steady and unhurried, and when she asked him why he had been so good to her from the very beginning, he finally said the words he'd been holding back for months, that he had fallen in love with her the moment he saw her in that diner, that he wasn't asking for anything, only that she knew he would be there, as a friend or as something more, whenever she was ready. 6 months later, Victoria stood in a small nursery holding her daughter for the first time, a baby girl with dark hair and eyes exactly like her father's, and beside her Marcus wept openly as he held his child for the first time in his life, whispering that she was perfect. When Victoria told him her name, Claire Hope Bennett Thornton, Marcus caught the second name immediately, and Victoria explained quietly that Andrew had proposed a month before, and that she had said yes. Something passed across Marcus's face, pain mixed unmistakably with acceptance, and he said simply that Andrew was a good man, better than he had been, and that he would be a good father to Claire. He promised, with a sincerity Victoria had never once heard from him during their marriage, that he would never let their daughter doubt how deeply she was loved, that he may have failed as a husband, but he would not fail her as a father, and somehow, watching him hold their child with such careful tenderness, Victoria found herself believing him completely. Andrew crossed the room and wrapped his arm gently around her waist, looking down at their daughter with quiet adoration, and Victoria felt something settle inside her that she hadn't felt in years, a profound and unshakable peace. Her life had not gone the way she once imagined it would on the night she walked into that Fifth Avenue penthouse in an emerald green dress, but it had become something far more honest, built not on performance or image, but on real love that showed up every single day without being asked. Outside the window, snow fell softly over Brooklyn, covering the city in fresh white powder, and Victoria understood, standing there between the two men who had shaped her past and her future, that sometimes the ending of one story is simply the quiet, hopeful beginning of another.